Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Dunne. I am a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., and a former U.S. diplomat who has served in the Middle East, including Jerusalem, for a number of years. Thank you for joining us for this webinar this morning at the Arab Center entitled Jerusalem's Religious Status Quo, Erosion and Future Implications. Let me sort of set the table for our discussion with a bit of historic context, because as you know, the struggle over Jerusalem and the many holy sites there that are holy to three major world religions has been sensitive, very sensitive politically and spiritually. And this has been true not just for the last few decades or even the last few centuries, but for many, many years before that, over 1900 years, as a matter of fact. In all these times, these sites have often been subjected to the violent whims of various occupation authorities. For example, there was the destruction of the Jewish Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD, its eventual replacement by the Dome of the Rock, or the Qubbat al-Sakhra, by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik in 691. And of course, there was the successive demolitions of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, first by the Persians in 614, and then by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim in 1009. Political control over these sacred and historical sites has changed hands many times. But since the late 19th century, the rights of the various religious communities have been governed by the so-called status quo, our subject today. Now, this was essentially a rules-making exercise that evolved over about 170 years, and it was intended to prevent conflict over religious sites, sometimes including international conflicts involving these same religious sites. Now, the status quo has its origins in decrees issued as far back as the mid-18th century by sultans of the Ottoman Empire, one of those occupying authorities that I mentioned at the beginning. These decrees specified how the Christian community would administer these sites and who had what rights to which site. Now, the intent was mainly to keep peace among the various Christian groups that were fighting over control over these sites, sometimes physically fighting over control over the sites. Now, these rules that were originally set down were expanded a number of times over the years to include sites holy to other religions as well. And they were set down, however vaguely, and that's important to remember, by a number of international treaties, including the Treaty of Paris in 1856 and the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. Finally, a British civil servant in Mandatory Palestine collected all of these iterations of the status quo into a single document. 1929, it was put out, and it was called the Status Quo in the Holy Places. And this is considered the most complete description of all of these arrangements available. Under these arrangements today, the Islamic Waqf in Jerusalem administers the Haram al-Sharif under the custodianship of the government of Jordan, while the Western Wall and the Western Wall Plaza, where Jews worship today at the site of the Second Temple, is controlled and administered by Israel, which also claims sovereignty, of course, and exercises administrative control over the entire city of Jerusalem and all of the sites and buildings inside it. Christian sites are administered by various Christian churches and sects. And it gets to be very complicated. The administration of the Holy Sepulchre itself, the single church complex, falls under the authority of 5 different Christian churches, for example. The fact remains, however, that the status quo agreement, despite recognition in a number of international documents and treaties, including the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty of 1994, has been observed as more of a handshake understanding than a set of binding commitments by the parties affected. And so since the Oslo process began, in which it became clear that the future status of Jerusalem was to be negotiated as part of a final status settlement to bring to an end, finally, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a number of different groups have been trying to establish their own facts on the ground to extend and claim control over these sites. In the 1990s, for example, these included efforts by the Islamic Waqf in Jerusalem to construct new mosques under the Haram al-Sharif itself. Even before that, in cooperation with the Israeli government, Jewish settler groups began increasingly establishing their presence in and around the old city of Jerusalem, including holy and archaeological sites. Plans are moving forward today to develop some of these sites, parts of these areas, into what some people have called biblical theme parks. And what this has led to in practice on the ground is breaking up traditional Arab neighborhoods and driving Palestinian residents out. Key Christian sites, too, are under threat, such as the Mount of Olives, which is now targeted for the establishment of an Israeli national park. This has also, of course, unsurprisingly, led to more instances of violence between Israeli security forces and Palestinians, including an incident, for example, in April, in which 150 Palestinian worshippers on the Haram al-Sharif itself were injured in clashes with Israeli riot police. The increasing lenience of the Israeli government in allowing more and more Jewish worshippers to pray on the Temple Mount in apparent contravention of the status quo itself has certainly poured a lot of fuel onto this particular fire. And such incidents as the one in April are by no means infrequent or unique. Now, the erosion of the status quo that we have been seeing, and we've been seeing accelerating in recent years, leads us to a number of important questions, which we are going to get to today. For example, what does the erosion of the status quo mean for the makeup of Jerusalem, including the future of the Palestinian presence in the city? How does the increasingly religious nature of the dispute, turning it from less of a political conflict into a religious fight, how does this affect Palestinian-Israeli dynamics? How does it affect Christian-Israel relations? And how does it affect international assumptions about the very nature of the conflict itself? And finally, and perhaps not finally, how does this all affect prospects for the two-state solution, which to this day is considered by most governments to be the bedrock, the foundation of a future final status agreement between the Palestinians and Israel? So, to take a close look at these other important questions, I am delighted to turn to our expert panelists this morning. You may have seen their bios in association with the announcement of this event, but let me briefly recount them for you. First of all, we are very happy to have Professor Nazmi Al-Jubeh, who is an associate professor of history and archaeology at Beirut University, or Birzeit University, pardon me, please. We also have Professor Daniel Seidemann, who is an Israeli attorney specializing in Israeli-Palestinian relations in Jerusalem and founder of Terrestrial Jerusalem. And we also have Michele Dunne, who is the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. And in the interest of full disclosure, she is my wife of 31 years, 3 of which we spent as US diplomats working together in Jerusalem, which started about the time of the Oslo or the Madrid conference. So welcome all of you, and thank you for giving us your time today. Here's our format. Each of our speakers will have 10 or so minutes to address the different facets of the status quo issue and its political and religious implications. We will then open it to questions from our viewers. For our viewers, please note that you don't have to wait until the Q&A session begins to submit your questions. You can use the Q&A feature in Zoom at any time to send questions to the panel, or you can email your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. With that, Professor Jubeh, let me turn it over to you.
Good morning. Actually, in Jerusalem, good evening. It's already 5 afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to be as brief as possible in a very complicated subject. I want to differentiate between two kinds of status quo. The one that you already mentioned, Mr. Dunne, which is a form of decree issued by the Ottoman Sultan in 1852 to regulate the relationship among the different Christian communities in Jerusalem and Bethlehem in their holy sites. And there is no official document in this decree, at least we don't know it. As you mentioned, a British official collected all the data, interviewed people, and came up with a document which we call it status quo. This is one. It is limited only to certain holy sites of Christian holy sites only. The other status quo is what I call it the de facto status quo, which is a form of expansion of regulations on holy sites, mainly in Jerusalem. But it has also other meanings, had political meaning, social meaning, economic dimensions, etc. I don't have the time to go in all of these meanings. So whenever we use the terminology status quo, mostly we mean different things. And I have to insist here, say, this is a very vague terminology. Nobody has a specific definition for the status quo. Even the Christian communities do not agree on the arrangements that is called status quo. For instance, I passed in the last 10 years a very detailed experience in restoring the Nativity Church in Bethlehem. And it was a very, very difficult task to coordinate between the 3 major churches who owns historical rights in the church. So still they do not agree even on the practices of what's going on inside these holy sites. So the definition in itself is a problematic. Using the history is also problematic. You have to deal with so many narratives about what status quo means. Between the 19th century and 1948, the last period of the Ottoman Empire and the British occupation and mandate of Palestine, the government or the residual government had to interfere so many times in order to decide the different relationships among the communities. For instance, in 1929, there was a huge dispute between Muslims and Jews about the use of the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, which is considered by the Muslims Burak Wall, and by the Jews part of the Second Temple. And that led to riots and very bloody riots. So governments were interfering all the time. Even in the 60s, when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre Church was collapsing, the Jordanian government had to interfere as a residual government in order to restore the Holy Sepulchre Church and to prevent its collapse. Because the different communities did not agree on restoring it. The same happened recently before 10 years in Bethlehem, when President Abbas issued a decree appointing non-patriarchal committee to restore the church, in spite that the church was really endangered, and the churches not do anything in order to stop the deterioration. So the interference of the government was for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of the holy sites. This was the major interference. Of course, there are a lot of conflicts. I don't want to go on all of them, but not to forget between the Copts and the Ethiopians with the Sultan monastery above the Church of Holy Sepulchre Church. Now, I'm coming to 1967. After the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem, we are living continuous deterioration of the status quo, both de facto and de jure. Both the status quo kinds are facing a big challenge from the Israeli policy. I will mention just a few elements, a few examples. The destruction of the Murabi quarter, which is now the plaza in front of the Wailing Wall. In 1967, in June, before the end of the war, 178 buildings were demolished within a few hours. The second issue is the confiscation of a strip of the old city, a very large strip, which is about 12% of the old city, located between the Armenian quarter and the Axa Mosque, and declare it as a Jewish neighborhood, Jewish quarter, in spite of the fact that the Jews do not own more than 13% of this area before 1948. So Jewish ownership in this area is about 13% of the whole area, but they confiscated the whole area in order to establish a Jewish neighborhood. Then in June 1967, sorry, the key of the Murabi gate, one of the gates of the Haram al-Sharif, of the Axa Mosque, was confiscated by the Israeli forces. So the Israelis placed themselves immediately in June 1967 as one of the owners of the Axa Mosque by owning one of the keys of the mosque. And then they established a checkpoint on that gate, where first the Israeli military police was stationed, and later the Israeli police replaced them. And this gate is still in the hand of the Israeli military forces. The Islamic Waqf do not have the key at all. They cannot open it, they cannot close the gate. Gradually, because of claims of security, the Israelis forced on the Axa Mosque a form that no gate can be opened without the Israeli permission, without the Israeli police permission. That means the Islamic Waqf cannot open any of the gates of the mosque without the presence of the Israeli police. And when they have a shortage of police, or claiming so, then the Waqf has to minimize the number of gates that they can be opened. Of course, that is not always going very smooth, sometimes with daily conflicts here and there. The next stage of erosion of status quo is the Israeli excavations below and around the Axa Mosque. And I mean below because I met some of the excavators once inside one of the water cisterns of the Axa Mosque in 1983. Now, most of the excavations are taking place underneath Islamic Waqf properties. All along the west wall of the Axa Mosque is tunneled by so-called Western Tunnel. And there are other tunnels. I don't want to bother you with other tunnels taking place below the old city, converting the underneath the old city in one archaeological excavation, which I don't know any serious archaeologist in the world who can accept this kind of archaeological work. Therefore, the aim is not recovery of the hidden history of Jerusalem, rather an instrument of control and settling process of the old city. Now, as you mentioned, sir, the Waqf did not construct a new mosque, but they restored an old hall, which is a form of basement. We call it the eastern basement of the Axa Mosque, which goes back also to the end of the 7th century. it was a form of basement and the storage room. The Waqf restored it to be used as a mosque. Now, this restoration evoked a lot of later reaction from the side of the Israelis to protest against the violence of the Awqaf against the Jewish archaeology and history on the Temple Mount, which is nonsense, because the whole itself is an ancient structure, goes back to the Umayyad period, and the Waqf did not destroy really any virgin layer. They removed a lot of them, that is true, and restored it in order to have a larger space for a prayer, especially in Ramadan and in the holy days. But as the reaction, since 2000, the Israelis took this occasion as a facade for restricting the administration means of the Islamic Waqf. As a result of that, the Waqf cannot restore anything, cannot installate anything inside the compound without Israeli permission. Even recently, through the attacks of the violent attacks of the Israeli police inside the compound, so many windows were destroyed of a beautiful artistic work of gyps and glass, and the Waqf prepared the replacement, and since months they cannot, I don't know, 5-6 months they are ready to be replaced. Until now did not get a permission. The Waqf cannot change any lamp inside the compound without Israeli permission. The last thing that I want to mention before I leave you, because my 10 minutes are already over, is that the Waqf ability to move and to administrate the site is becoming every day less and less. They are losing control over the site, and the intrusions of the daily intrusions of certain Israelis, I'm not saying Israelis, but certain Israelis who are insisting to make prayer inside the mosque or to make a visitation by force in the mosque, is converting slowly the conflict also to a religious conflict, which we were all trying to avoid for long decades. This is what I call it, maybe the last, one of the last citadels in Jerusalem, where the whole national religious conflicts are concentrated. This is a place where we are going to have peace or bloody religious conflicts in the future. I think it's in the hands of the Israelis to decrease or to increase this conflict over the site. Next week, we have Israeli holidays, and we hope that at least these holidays will pass with very little bloodshed. I'm not sure that bloodshed will not take place, but I hope that it will be as minimum as possible. I left a lot of subjects out of discussion. Maybe during the questions, I can answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jubeh, for that very comprehensive and interesting, not only historic, but contemporary overview of what is going on. I do have one quick question for you before we move on to Danny, and that is, I have seen this written about, and a growing fear among Palestinians that especially as more and more Jewish worshipers are allowed to enter the Haram and pray, and we also saw the intrusion of the right-wing flag marchers, I believe last May, which was another less of a worship effort than a nationalistic assertion of authority over the Haram Sharif. There are some who fear that there is a plan to essentially divide the area of the Haram Sharif and its esplanade, so that you might perhaps have areas for Jewish worshipers and separate areas for Palestinian worshipers. I wonder how you evaluate those worries. Do you think that situation is headed in that direction? And if so, what would be the impact on not only Palestinians and their access to the Haram area, but to freedom of worship in Jerusalem itself?
We have a model before, which is the model of the Ibrahimi Mosque, the patriarch graves in Hebron. The model is there. We don't have to think about what will be there. I think the Israeli official policy is dictated by several elements, international relations, but also interior politics. And they are always saying, which was true and still true, every international relation is a reflection of interior interest. And I think the composition of the Israeli government, and it won't be changed in the coming few years, is dictated by a group of extremists, regardless whether it is left, center, or center right wing government. One of the points will be continue to be the Axa Mosque and the control of the Axa Mosque. It is a very realistic. The destruction is very realistic. The partition is very realistic. Partition in space and time is very realistic. We have to take it very seriously. The impact, I can tell you, the impact will be very bloody impact. There is no way to solve this conflict without a huge bloodshed. Now, I'm always asked by my Israeli colleagues and friends why you do not recognize our spiritual relationship to the site. The question is so naive, because I think that what does it mean recognizing? Recognizing that, what does it mean? Secondly, my answer always, this is an issue for the day after agreement and not the day before agreement. I think during the conflict, we are all using national religious symbols and employing them in the conflict. But after the conflict over, hopefully one day, and peace could be reached between two sides, the symbols will be decreased or less played in the conflict. Then there is a space of dialogue about maybe some kind of participation, recognition, whatever. I don't know. But before ending the conflict, I think the question is impossible.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we will turn it over to Danny Seidemann.
Thank you. It's always difficult to follow my friend, colleague, and mentor, Nazmi, who has forgotten more about these issues than I have ever learned, but I will do my best. Go ahead. I will divide this up, slice this up slightly differently. The status quo is used in three distinct contexts. One is the one that Nazmi spoke about, and that is the status quo in contested religious sites, principally the Christian sites. Those issues remain extremely relevant, but they're not important for our discussion. Are there bitter relations inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Just go to the roof where you'll see the Ethiopians and the Copts, and you'll see that mutual hatred is not the monopoly of Jews and Arabs in Jerusalem, or Israelis and Palestinians. But this is not an issue that is directly impacted by the conflict. I think we can ignore it. The second status quo deals with the status quo on Al-aqsa, the Temple Mount. Temple Mount, Al-aqsa, I have to be politically correct. And that is an entirely new phenomenon, because there was no status quo on Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, prior to 1967, because there were no Jewish claims on the Temple Mount until 1967. For 1,000 years, there has been no prayer, Jewish prayer on the Mount. And partially that is the result of Islamic control, but it is no less a factor of the overwhelming majority of rabbinic authorities say it is not only forbidden for Jews to pray on the Mount, we can't even go there. So during the mandate, the Temple Mount was important for Jews, but it had no practical implications. Nobody was seeking to go there. The Al-aqsa was barred to non-Muslims until the end of the Crimean War, and was open to non-Muslims only after that. So this term status quo becomes relevant when you have a contested site. And that only began in 1967, immediately after the war, when a fringe in Israel insisted on an aggressive application of Israeli sovereignty. It's Israel to the Mount, and particularly to Jewish prayer. And the first appeal to the Supreme Court after the war dealt with the issue of Jewish prayer. At the time, this was viewed as a lunatic fringe. Nobody was interested in it. What emerged from this and another whole set of circumstances is something that has come to be known as the status quo, but it is the status quo that applies to Al-Aqsa, Temple Mount, and not to the Christian sites. Now, everybody will tell you there are different interpretations of the status quo. That's correct. So much so that it has no significance. Not correct. I would say, yes, indeed, there are different interpretations that can be made in good faith, but there is a core. And that core can best be summarized by no other than Netanyahu, who was cajoled and badgered and bludgeoned into saying a few words by Secretary of State Kerry, who did a masterful job. Very simple. Muslims pray on the Temple Mount. Non-Muslims visit the Temple Mount. That is the core of the status quo that emerged after 1967. Now, if you want to flesh this out a bit, I would try empirically to describe a little more in detail what that core status quo means. The Temple Mount Al-Aqsa is exclusively a place of worship for Muslims, which is open to the respectful and dignified visits of non-Muslims in coordination with the Waqf, the Islamic endowment that controls the Mount, and in accordance with the decorum on the site. Now, throughout the years, the Temple Mount movement moved from a lunatic fringe movement to a fringe movement and began to become mainstream. And there was a crack in the unanimity of rabbinic authority, and the rabbis, almost 100 in number, who are associated with the settlers in the West Bank, began not only to permit Jewish visits to the Mount and Jewish prayer, but to encourage it. And we have seen here what I call the erosion of the status quo in a number of ways. And I would say that this has been going on for years, but was accelerated under Netanyahu, starting about 2017. There was already a permissiveness that preceded that. Netanyahu deserved good grades on maintaining the status quo. Before that, there was a pattern where tensions would rise according to the Hebrew and Islamic calendar, and as they rose, Secretary Kerry would spend hours on the phone with Netanyahu and the king, and he would pull us back from the brink. But since 2017, there has been Jewish prayer on the Mount. Initially, with a wink and a nod, pious mumbling. Let's see what we get away with. At this point, it is open. And there's no doubt about it, because the Temple Mount movement when they go off the mount, they go to YouTube and post it, and they sing their achievement from the rooftops, which means that the status quo is being violated. I was at Haram Al-Aqsa Temple Mount last week. It was controlled. It was surrounded by police, but it was there. So to all intents and purposes, the status quo has been eroded and in some ways has collapsed. What does this indicate? Well, you asked earlier, Charles, about how American policy has affected this. Trump at one point said, Jerusalem is off the table. It's not a permanent status issue. And what we're seeing in Israeli policies across the board is the implementation of the Trump plan without Trump. Now, all Israeli prime ministers have, since 1967, has said, all of this is ours, including the Temple Mount, but they treated religious sites, Muslim and Christian, with reverence. That restraint is now gone. And we are acting as sole proprietors. Secondly, what we're witnessing here is the ascendancy of faith communities that weaponize faith. These are groups, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, whose claims to Jerusalem are exclusionary, they're absolute, and at times incendiary. Among Jews, it is the Temple Mount movement. And the biblically motivated settlers who we'll talk about in a moment. Among Muslims, it's certain iterations of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in the United States, it's Trump's political base. It is the end of days dispensationalist evangelicals who make the settlers and the Brotherhood look tame. For years, I have been cautioning that these groups, the settlement groups and the Temple Mount movement is becoming more powerful. Under Trump and Netanyahu, they weren't becoming more powerful. They were the power. I can think of no two people on the planet who are less pious, less men of faith than Trump and Netanyahu. But in Washington, policy was driven by the end of days evangelicals, and in Jerusalem by the devout Netanyahu, by the Temple Mount and settler movement. These trends have accelerated, and Charles, you mentioned something that most people ignore, alongside of Jewish prayer. And I think that there is an attempt by the Israeli police to curb this and somehow to phase it out. There's a secondary a cause of concern, which is becoming dominant, and that is Israeli nationalistic triumphalism, marching on the Mount, singing nationalistic songs with Israeli flags. And that took place on Tisha B'Av just a few weeks ago. And that is no less dangerous because Nazmi, I'm your occupier, so correct me if I'm wrong. What I have observed is that for Palestinians, Haram al-Sharif, Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, is the least occupied place in Jerusalem. It is the safest place in Jerusalem. And today, during visiting hours of non-Muslims, it is the most occupied place in Jerusalem. You'll hear a lot about shrinking the conflict. We're not shrinking the conflict. We are shrinking Palestinian space. If the current trajectory continues, there will be blood. And I think measured in weeks and months and not in years. Just before this session, I called one of the senior diplomats in Jerusalem who monitors and tries to intervene on this, and just to see if there's something that I needed to know. And I was told, Danny, the consensus is this is going down the tubes. And generally, I'm not an alarmist, but at this point, I am deeply concerned. I will let Michele address some of the other issues. I want to allude at least to the third type of status quo, which is really the religious equilibrium. in the spiritual, religious, historical, and cultural core of Jerusalem, which is the area that resonates with biblical history. It's the Old City and the visual basin surrounding the Old City, most prominently the Mount of Olives. We have been witnessing for many years accelerated settlement activity in this area by biblically motivated settlers and their increasing impact on shaping the landscape and the public domain. That has now accelerated greatly. And what we are witnessing is no less than the encirclement of the Old City by biblically motivated settlers and biblically themed parks and trails and projects in a way that we have not witnessed in the past. The most prominent development here is a plan which is on the agenda of the planning committees to establish an Israeli national park over the Mount of Olives, and specifically over the Christian sites on the Mount of Olives. There's no innocent interpretation of this. In the past, Israel exhibited reverence and self-restraint towards these sites and said, we're not going to impose our national symbols over the most holy sites in Christianity. We won't do it. Well, not only are we doing it, but our Parks Authority is one of the most wonderful organizations in the country, except in East Jerusalem, when they are run lock, stock, and barrel by the settlers. By creating this national park, Israel is placing the churches under the authority of extreme biblically motivated settlers. What could go wrong? And they covet church properties. We know which properties. We have the documentation. And this is pending. And this is something that will, it's not a question of a bad thing happening in Jerusalem. This will transform Jerusalem into something that will not be recognizable to us. You know, in Jerusalem, you have 1 square kilometer in the Old City. You got malls in the United States with more floor space than the entire Old City. And there you have the tectonic plates of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but they managed to cohabit. Contradictory narratives cohabit the same space. What we're witnessing here is the Trump plan writ large, the fragmentation of Palestinian East Jerusalem, the denationalization of the Palestinians, and the marginalization of Christian and Muslim equities, turning an already vulnerable Christian community into, well, Jerusalem will not be a hospitable place for the vulnerable Christian community should this proceed. And it's not because the Christians are being targeted, it's because it's ours and we will do whatever we want. One last word, which not informative. The history of Jerusalem is littered with leaders, tyrants, Caesars, patriarchs, religious leaders who aspired to absolutely control the city. None of their stories ended well. Jerusalem is a very wise city for those who treat her with the reverence that she deserves. It is one nasty town for those who treat those complexities in a cavalier way. And what we are witnessing is a grave threat to the very character of Jerusalem. It is a grave threat to the nature of the conflict. It is a grave threat to local, regional, and global stability, and will certainly make the already challenged prospect of a political agreement less and less achievable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny, for your assessment, which is very alarming to say the least. And hopefully we can talk a bit more about that during the Q&A session. Before I turn it over to our final speaker, a brief reminder that you can submit questions to the panelists through Zoom's Q&A feature or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. So last but of course not least, we have Michele, who will round out the discussion with a development or an overview of recent developments on the ground, assessment of future implications for the various communities, and perhaps a few U.S. policy recommendations, which I would also like to follow up on in the Q&A. Michele, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Charles. And I really enjoyed hearing Nazmi and Danny's comments as well. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Christian community. And there are many things that we know. We know that the Palestinian Christian population has been diminishing for a long time. That's an old story, and these old stories of the skirmishes among the different Christian sects inside the Holy Sepulchre, are legendary. And by the way, I saw there was a question about that. I believe that the sects inside the Holy Sepulchre are several Orthodox churches, the Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Greek, and Syriac, and then the Roman Catholics, who in this case mean the Franciscan order, are the ones inside the Holy Sepulchre, I believe. So these things have been going on for a long time. But what I think is newer is a pattern of noticeable deterioration in relations between the Christian church leaders on the one hand, and the Israeli government. And in fact, I think we've seen the Christian church leaders, despite their, disputes about who gets to do which prayer service where at which time and that type of thing, in the major churches, despite that, we're seeing more unity and acting together among some of these church leaders because of this real deterioration. So, for example, some of the things they're complaining about is increased Israeli police obstruction of Christian worshipers, such as, Orthodox trying to attend the Easter Holy Fire ceremony, or Catholics barred from entering Jerusalem, Palestinians for the Palm Sunday procession, that type of thing, and as well as increased and now regular incidents of harassment of Christian clergy by Jewish extremists in and around the Old City. So, the church leaders have, really complained about this. I'll say more about that in a moment. In addition, there is this issue that Danny mentioned, this sense that Israeli settler organizations such as Ateret HaKohanim and Al-Ad, Al-Ad is the City of David Foundation, are now really targeting Christian properties and holy sites with the aim of kind of, pushing the Christians aside and changing the character of areas from Christian to Jewish. This has been going on for a long time with Palestinians in general and with Muslims. So, there's ongoing controversy around a number of Old City properties. The Greek Orthodox Church just lost a major lawsuit against the sale of some properties in the Old City to Ateret HaKohanim. And then there is this big story of the Mount of Olives that Danny just mentioned. So, and I want to add a couple of things to what Danny mentioned. So this is an idea of taking this whole slice of the Mount of Olives that is pretty much totally occupied by Christian properties, some of them Orthodox, some of them Catholic, and they include some really important ones like the Garden of Gethsemane. So really some really important sites for Christian that are regular sites of, for Christian pilgrims and so forth, to take this whole area and to make it part of the so-called Jerusalem Walls National Park. And this is a plan that came from Al-Ad, came from the people who brought you everything that has happened in Silwan, in the City of David, and has, in which, and I want to say that the Israeli National Parks Authority, as I understand it, Danny, acts as a partner with Al-Ad. I mean, Al-Ad is actually, carrying out, a lot of the work in around the old city in this, as you said, biblically motivated attempt to change the character. And what we mean by change the character is change the character to really bring out the Jewish historical and religious claims and, to the sites, and to minimize or erase Christian or Muslim claims to these sites. So this is, part of the encirclement of the old city. I mean, Danny could give you a wonderful briefing showing you Zalwan in the south, Sheikh Jarrah in the north, and then off to the east of the old city, the Mount of Olives, this encirclement he was speaking of. And to, as I said, to really, to have as many Jews as possible living in those areas, and to have public facilities that bring out the Jewish character and to the exclusion of the other religious characters. Now, Christian leaders say they were never consulted on this plan to make a national park on the Mount of Olives. And they sent an absolutely infuriated letter, to Israeli authorities in February of this year, strongly opposing the plan. There was an expose about the plan published in the Times of Israel. And the issue was also raised with the Israeli government by members of the US Congress. And, just to say a little bit more about what would this national park be and what it would do, it would give the Israeli National Parks Authority, and thereby the Israeli government, the ability to make changes, to prevent the churches from making any changes that they would want to do on their properties and so forth. And it's a way of creeping, Israeli control over what have been up to now, for hundreds of years, in many cases, church owned and run properties. So the church leaders in Jerusalem objected strongly because this plan was supposed to come up for Israeli municipal approval in early March, and it was temporarily taken off the agenda. But as we know, and this is a long story with settlement plans in the West Bank and so forth, things maybe are taken off the agenda when they become a little too hot politically, but before you know it, they're back on. And this plan is back on the agenda for consideration by the municipality in late December of this year. So, that's a major area of concern to church leaders in Jerusalem right now. And just in general, and Danny alluded to this too, there's this sense that the Israeli government is much less concerned than it was at an earlier time of being much less concerned about being deferential to Christian as well as Muslim authorities, much less concerned about creating the impression that the Israeli government is a responsible custodian of holy places, and that it will, respect the religious plurality of Jerusalem. I mean, I was in Jerusalem recently, had the opportunity to meet with some people, including a senior church official, and I asked that official, well, you have all these concerns. Who's your contact in the Israeli Prime Minister's office? With whom can you raise this? Well, there is none. And these church authorities, one of the reasons they're putting out these public letters of protests and so forth is that this is something that has changed over the last decade or so. They no longer are allowed to speak to anyone at a high level. They're not considered important enough to speak to anyone at a high level in the Israeli government. And so, no wonder there's been an exchange of increasingly harsh statements. I mentioned that the Christian leaders put out a statement complaining of, these attacks, harassment, groups being able to purchase properties through underhanded dealings, etc. They put out a a statement in an open letter complaining about all of these things in December 2021. And in that, they requested an urgent dialogue with the government of Israel. And they said, look, you created the Jewish quarter, in Jerusalem, which is a special cultural and heritage zone. Well, we want to have a dialogue with the Israeli government about creating a Christian cultural and heritage zone in the Christian quarter that cannot be interfered with. And the response they got to this, when I read the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement, I have to tell you, I was shocked. I'm a former American diplomat. Charles mentioned that we served in Jerusalem a couple of decades ago. I could not have imagined the Israeli government at that time issuing the kind of response that they did, a very terse statement calling the church leaders' statement, quote, baseless, distorted, and quote, infuriating, saying that Christian leaders should be more mindful of the possible consequences of what they say, and closing by wishing them a Merry Christmas. I mean, it was really an insulting statement to, what had been I think a serious proposal by the church leaders to say, could we have a dialogue about creating a Christian cultural zone? So I just, want to say that the tone is very different. And, Christian leaders, talk about this, about how it's very different dealing with Israeli government officials now. I mean, maybe it was never perfect, it was never a honeymoon, but they are given much less deference, much less respect, and just not even considered important enough, as I said, to have significant interlocutors within the Israeli government. So then this leads to this, these exchanges of harsh, public statements, and then, ongoing lack of understanding. So I'll stop there for now and go to questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michele. I want to offer my thanks to all of the panelists for their very interesting, as I noted, very alarming remarks. We have several questions already in the queue, but as moderator, let me kick it off with one or two. And I'd like to focus again on this question of how, in general, the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem has, as Israel's capital, has affected the whole situation on the ground, and the relevance of the status quo. And in this connection, I'd really like to ask, what is your impression of what the Biden administration has done or could do in this context? I see they've more or less avoided engaging on this particular issue, so they seem to be comfortable with it as ongoing U.S. policy. Is that your impression as well? Are they essentially ignoring this very important development, which, as I believe every speaker has pointed out, has led to a rapid deterioration of the situation on the ground and the various relations between the Israeli government and the religious authorities? And I would kick that out to all three of you, if you would like to share your thoughts on that.
Shall I begin?
Don't think.
Yeah.
Nazmi, go ahead.
Danny, please.
Okay. There has been a major impact of recognition and the move of the embassy, because it sent the message to Israel, Jerusalem is yours. It's off the table. It's not subject for negotiations. But there's something more important. I think we can say that some of us are aware of the dysfunctionality of U.S. foreign policy on Israel-Palestine for years. And there was not much progress under Obama. But Secretary John Kerry did a masterful job in crisis management. He was the mediator. He was on this all the time, and he deserves a huge amount of credit. Now, Trump is gone, but we are left with an eroded status quo. triumphalism, but more than anything else, this is more than an Israeli policy. It's a state of mind. Jerusalem is ours. Now, I categorically say this is not being ignored by the Biden administration. I know I have my critique of certain policies. My greatest fear from the recognition and the move of the embassy is that the United States would disqualify itself from any role of broker. It would become partisan. Instead of mediating between Israelis and Palestinians, it would be turned into an Israeli cheerleader. And that's precisely what happened. And the way of putting, of correcting that would by sending a signal, reopen the consulate. And for domestic and considerations and international considerations, an explicit undertaking by the Biden administration hasn't been fulfilled. And the United States has not recouped its critical role. And have no doubt, the United States left a vacuum, and nobody has filled that vacuum. Nobody is mediating successfully between the Jordanians, the Palestinians, and the Israelis. There are talks going on. A new page has been opened, but there hasn't been the kind of engagement that can bear fruit now. This is being managed 24/7 by a wonderful team of young US diplomats in what I call the consulate, not an embassy to me. And they have the backing of the senior levels in the administration. The style of the Biden administration is to engage Israel behind the scenes. Now, you can criticize that, but I can assure you one thing, the results aren't great, and they may be inadequate, and there may be things that the administration should be doing that they're not. This is not a subject that is being neglected. During recent events, I found myself in WhatsApp with folks here in Jerusalem, and in Washington, it was like play-by-play, baseball game. We were following that closely. So I can assure you, at least in that regard.
Thank you. Would any of our other speakers like to chip in? Michele?
Yes,
I
will.
Perfect.
Michele? Okay. Until now, Biden administration did not manage to implement its promise to open the U.S. Consulate General in East Jerusalem. So I do not feel any change in the United States policy towards Jerusalem or towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general. Aside that the previous administration had managed the Trump decision to legitimize all the Israeli illegal actions in East Jerusalem, in the annexed East Jerusalem, including land grab and settlement activities and marginalization of the Palestinian community in East Jerusalem, etc., etc. The impact of a Trump decision is tremendous. If we take into consideration that with his genius idea of Abraham agreements, Abraham Path, bringing Arab countries in normalization with Israel before solving the conflict, which elongated, obviously, this conflict for maybe a few decades forward. Again, I think we have to deal with Jerusalem as a core issue in the conflict. There is no peace. There is no two-state solution without peace and solution in Jerusalem. This has to be a basic element for anybody. I think that in Jerusalem, we have 3 religions and 2 nations and international interests. Any foreign policy, regardless whether there is US policy or European Union policy, has to be based on these 3 elements. You cannot really solve one and leave the other 2. this conflict over Jerusalem, well, as I mentioned before, is ready to explode in a tremendous form. We know that touching the so-called status quo, regardless of our definitions of it, will bring within it a huge shards of pottery, which will flow in our faces. We have to be very sensitive. You know, you cannot declare a Muslim cemetery as a national park. You know, besides in the shadow of the eastern wall of the city. You cannot continue to grab land from the Muslim cemetery. You cannot continue to destroy the cemetery in Mamilla, etc. This will be accumulated potential for violence. And we know when Jerusalem rise up, its voice reached everywhere because it is Jerusalem. I think Biden administration is asked really to come back in big in Jerusalem first, and then the general Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I'm not so optimistic. I don't think that they are ready. They are now involved in Ukraine. They are involved in Iran issues, etc. So the Israeli politicians are very happy that all of the conflicts around us in the world attracting the world attention, so they feel free to do whatever they want in the region. But the question is, does that solve the Israeli problems for security, coexistence, recognition? I think this is a full irritation.
Michele?
Yeah, I agree with what Danny said about how, the President Trump's, recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and taking it off the table, quote unquote. I mean, church leaders in 2017 sent a letter to Trump begging him not to do this. The church leaders, in Jerusalem, saying that this would create untold harm. And they were right. It has. Their situation has deteriorated a great deal. But one thing I think we need to point out is, what Israel has chosen to do and what President Trump chose to do was to privilege certain Christian voices over others. And those are these American evangelical Christian leaders who are, very strong supporters of Israel. And, we understand the ideological motivations behind that and so forth, and to pretty much ignore more mainstream leaders. So there I'm talking about the churches, in Jerusalem itself, the Orthodox and Catholic churches, as well as sort of mainstream churches outside Jerusalem, the Vatican, or we speak about the mainstream Protestant churches in the United States, most of whom were very concerned about the change in US policy towards Jerusalem and opposed it. So now, if we want to talk about the Biden administration, there are certain things the Biden administration is doing better than the Trump administration, right? That's one of them, right? They're no longer, have their ear toward to these evangelical leaders. They are listening to the mainstream churches, whether it's in the United States or or in Jerusalem. But so, and of course, the Biden administration has changed certain elements of policy to be more responsive to Palestinians, to have better relations with the Palestinian Authority, restore aid, all those type of things. And diplomatically, they've opened up this Palestinian Affairs Unit. Now, as Danny said, it's not a consulate because the Israeli government objects to the reestablishment of a consulate. And frankly, it seems the Biden administration just hasn't decided to stand up to the Israeli government, which it could have so if it chose to, and say, well, there are a lot of Israeli consulates in the United States, that there is a diplomatic way that governments usually deal with these things reciprocally. But they've chosen not to do that. I think what we're seeing is that Biden will do certain things. I mean, during his recent visit, I think he tried to show some sensitivity to religious concerns and so forth. But they're not dealing with this issue at a high level. I mean, Danny was talking about Secretary Kerry getting involved. I think, the Biden administration is much less willing to get involved at a high level unless perhaps things really blow up. They're kind of keeping things more, at the working level. And of course, they have not reversed the Trump recognition of Jerusalem because they don't want to pay a domestic political price. So, that's where we have it. I do think that, they will be more responsive to concerns of religious communities in Jerusalem than the Trump administration was. But, they're not willing to devote a great deal of effort.
Thank you very much. We have quite a few questions in the queue, so let me get right at them. And I think I'll direct this one to Danny, and obviously whichever panelist would like to comment further, feel free. This one is from Babakar Ziad, and the question is Israel playing the game of switching the Palestinian occupation from a human rights / political one to a religious one? Specifically, he asked, by claiming and digging for religious sites in Jerusalem. Is this intended to muddy the waters, to switch the essential nature of the conflict, in other words?
My answer has to be cautious because most of the senior ministers in this government are secular. When I showed one of the senior officials what was going on in and around the old city, and he was completely clueless, he very candidly said to me, Danny, speak slowly and simply. We're from Tel Aviv, and in Tel Aviv, we don't do God in holy sites. So there's an element of genuine cluelessness about this, and not malice. However, to a certain extent, it reminds me of certain dynamics in the United States. You have liberals and moderates who are multi-subject, multi-issue people, and a minority driven by one issue who galvanize power, and they drive the events. Today, the discourse in Jerusalem is driven by those who weaponize faith, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And the events in Jerusalem are driven by the same groups. And they are not the majority. And they are not a majority of the members of the current government. But they're doing it anyway, partially because there is little pushback from the leaders of so-called moderate political parties in Israel. No pushback. So you have one group that is willing to go to the mattresses over this, and another one who's not doing anything or saying anything. I believe, we're in dire straits. You can't walk away from this conflict. If you walk away from this conflict, you're going to get another round of convulsive violence, worse than what we saw in May of 2021. But you're not going to get negotiations with this dysfunctional government and a fragmented, moribund Palestinian Authority. So if you can't get anything done, you can't do anything, what the hell do you do? This is an issue that can be challenged. You can reestablish the primacy of a Jerusalem that speaks in multiple voices, where no community has to struggle to maintain its identity, its viability, or the inviolability of its holy sites. That's achievable, but it's not going to happen on its own, and it will require robust international engagement by friends of Israel and the friends of Palestinians at the highest levels, including the prominent church leaders. That is achievable.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Orinier, and this gets to one of the things we've raised here, which is, our lines of communication on these various issues with the Israeli government. Michele said something about the lack of communication, or at least effective communication, between the Christians and the government of Israel. This is his question: is there any direct communication between the Israeli authorities, government, police, etc., and Palestinian agencies, the PA, the Waqf, to manage topics related to the status quo and negotiate or resolve conflicts? And if not, who can effectively play a mediating role? Is it Jordan? Is it the US? Is it the Biden administration? Can they make any efforts? They seem to be managing, in some sense, relations with the Palestinians overall, but are they focused to any extent on the Biden administration, that is, on status quo issues? I would direct that first to Professor Jubeh to talk about the PA and maybe the role that they're playing, if any.
Yes, the question is multi-layered. I'll try to make it as easy as possible. A few weeks ago, we wanted to restore a historic building next to the Axa Mosque, a building of 14th century. So we prepared the whole plans and the whole technical issues, and we applied it to the municipality of Jerusalem because we need a permission to restore the building. The municipality agreed, and then they asked us to get a permission from the Israeli police. We went to the Israeli police and they said, we do not object, but during the restoration, we have to close the gate of the mosque, one of the gates of the mosque. So if you allow us to close it for 1 year, which is actually the duration of the project, we will give you a permission. Then we had to get a permission. Of course, we rejected, but then we had to get a permission from the Israeli Department of the Israeli Authority of Antiquities, because it's a historical building. And we got the feeling that they are playing with us, all kinds of game. Finally, we stopped the project, and the building will continue to deteriorate. There is direct Waqf contact with the Israeli police, because they have to coordinate every day which gates and which hour will be open of the mosque. If they want to bring books to the library of the Axa Mosque, they need a permission from the Israeli police. If they want to installate one cable of electricity inside the mosque, they have to get permissions from several authorities. So there is this kind of relationship. Now, on the higher level, there is a relationship between the Jordanian government as a custodian of the holy sites, Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, and the Israeli government. This is mainly between the Ministry of Waqf in Jordan and the Hashemite Palace from one side, and the Israeli government, especially Foreign Ministry, from the other side. This goes through mostly the Jordanian ambassador in Tel Aviv, who communicates with the Israelis. For instance, yesterday, the general director of the Axa Mosque was attacked in his home. His house was searched and he was arrested. We don't know why, nobody knows why. Then the ambassador has to interfere in order to release him. Now, with the Palestinian Authority, the Israelis are refusing to have official contacts on issue of Jerusalem because they consider the city is a pure Israeli. The Palestinian Authority has no say in Jerusalem at all, according to the Israeli decision, including the Palestinian Authority does not have the right to subsidize any activity in Jerusalem in any field of in culture, social welfare, etc. It's absolute forbidden. So there is no official PA Israeli relationship in Jerusalem. In the previous decades, the Israelis managed to destroy and to eliminate actually any kind of local leadership in Jerusalem, which was in the past represented through the Orient House and late Faisal al-Husseini. The Israelis eliminated that totally. So we do not have any kind of direct relationship with the Israeli administration concerning the city at all, or concerning issues of public interest. Of course, we have as individuals relationships with the Israeli administration because we are annexed to the Israelis. So all of our life has to go through the Israeli different ministries and departments.
Thank you very much. I have an emailed question from William Gant, and this is directed to Michele, and I want to combine it with another question, which I think is related. And the question is, why is Israel not worried about upsetting the Arab countries with whom it recently signed peace agreements, obviously related to issues over violations of the status quo? And from John Ginsburg, can you see a scenario where an incident at the Temple Mount can lead to the destabilization of Arab countries that have peace treaties with Israel?
Yeah, look, my understanding of those various different agreements, brokered under the Abraham Accords, is that, each of those Arab countries has specific sort of strategic reasons for which they wanted relations with Israel, right? Whether it's, Morocco and the Western Sahara, or, a country like the United Arab Emirates, and, seeking a high degree of technological security and economic cooperation with, what they view as the region's leading power, Israel. So, those countries, I think, have their specific things they wanted out of these agreements that, of course, were not related at all to Palestine and to issues there, or to religious issues. Now, have those governments sort of thought through the implications of the questions I'm being asked here? I mean, we've already seen, a couple of episodes in which things have flared dangerously in Jerusalem, in which Gaza became involved, and in which these Arab countries sort of tried to sort of, hide in corners, and not deal with this issue very much. So, it's hard to say. I mean, I do think that there's a difference, with, overall solidarity with the Palestine cause, among Arabs and Muslims worldwide, and Jerusalem and the Muslim holy places there, as well as, for some people, the Christian holy places. But, I think there's a difference in terms of how it resonates, and the possible, implications. So, I mean, look, as a person who studied Egypt for a long time, we can see how, Egypt tried, in many cases, whenever there would be sort of a blow up of tension between Israel and Palestinians, or on religious issues, Egypt would sort of, try to gauge it. Is this something we can just ignore, or can we just make a statement? Do we have to bring our ambassador home for a month or a few months, or, how do we handle this without actually, breaking our treaty with Israel? And so, I would expect to see those kind of sort of conflict management strategies, whether any of these countries would become actively involved in trying to mediate differences or persuade Israel to change its policies. I'm less sanguine about that, but I would actually be interested to hear if Nazmi or Danny think different about this.
Go ahead. If either of you two would like to comment, and then Danny, I think you had a comment as well.
I would like to comment briefly. A while back, I participated in a Zoom session with folks from around the Arab world, including Emiratis, with whom I have little contact. These are the waning days of Netanyahu's government. And the Emirati said to me with a bit of a sneer, "Yeah, but your government doesn't listen to you." And my response was, "You're entirely right, but my government listens to you. And nobody can tell you that you don't have a stake, that you don't have equity in Al-Aqsa. In part, they're ignorant of the issues. In part, they're scared of the issues for good reason. But there hasn't been no engagement. Michele is right, but there is potential here. And it is challenging, but one of the ways of reestablishing the equilibrium is pivoting normalization, which so far has been used to marginalize the Palestinians and the Jordanians, by the way, who are not involved in this process, and to pivot it in the service of restabilizing Jerusalem. That is not going to happen on its own as well. It will require a major and sustained effort. It is worth the effort because one ignores Al-Aqsa at great peril. Enough said.
Okay, thank you. In fact, this question is closely related to this. This is from Khalil Jashan of the Arab Center, and it is directed to you, Danny. And the question is, based on the current turbulent Israeli politics, is the issue of Jerusalem, old or new, still on the negotiating table in any form? Which is just simply, essentially, how to manage Jerusalem. As a longtime observer, is there a practical diplomatic way that you see left to respect and share the holy places? And this gets to the question of, is there room left for either the current status quo or a new status quo in some form? And I would add to that, how could that possibly be negotiated?
This conflict ends in Jerusalem where it doesn't end at all. Full stop. The prospect of ending this conflict in the foreseeable future is indeed remote, but stabilizing Jerusalem and protecting the equities of the two peoples, Israeli and Palestinian, and the three religions in the city is absolutely critical in keeping even a flicker of hope alive for future agreements, and especially for maintaining and encouraging the religious, spiritual, cultural, historical integrity of Jerusalem. There is a vital national interest. It's not merely UNESCO and culture, it is a geopolitical interest. When things are dangerous in Jerusalem, it's a matter of homeland security in the United States and Europe, because what starts in Jerusalem doesn't stay in Jerusalem. I would very much encourage not to abandon the status quo. Again, you tinker with Jerusalem, again, at great peril. Mm-hmm. It needs to be restored. And that restoring of the status quo cannot be done. Nazmi is entirely correct about the police and the what. That's not going to solve the problem. We need robust engagement from the king, the prime minister, Abbas, with a third-party interlocutor who will rebuild the status quo. Now, since the 67, the Israeli interpretation was, we're sovereign, we can do what we want. And the Palestinian interpretation was, we're occupied, you can't do what you want except an extremist. That was viable because there was pragmatism, good faith, and goodwill. Today, there is no pragmatism, no good faith, and no goodwill. And that is not something that can change overnight. It has to be rebuilt. And that will require a lot of work. I'll give you good news and bad news. Prime Minister Lapid visited Amman a short while ago, 2-3 weeks ago, and met with King Abdullah. And King Abdullah asked him, please take a Quran back to Jerusalem for the Al-aqsa Mosque for me. And he said, no. Lapid said, no. I'm baffled. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? How is the Israeli national interest served by that? On the other hand, I just saw that Lapid is planning another visit to the king. And that's not accidental. I mean, the atmosphere today is, this is a powder keg. And there are efforts afoot to defuse this. So I am seeing modest signs of encouragement that this is beginning to get the attention that it deserves. It may be too little too late.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am sorry we have to break this off at this time because we have a lot of other intriguing questions in the queue, and this panel has been so interesting, especially for me personally, having served in Jerusalem for 3 years and tried to wrestle with some of these issues 20 years ago and the differences between what we're looking at now and what we were trying to do. I mean, there are many similarities, and also there are some kind of shocking differences that I think you as the panelists have really brought out today. So, thank you very much to our audience for joining us today and engaging with our speakers. And thank you again to our panel for being so generous with your time and really valuable insights. I personally appreciated it very much. And my apologies to all of those who submitted questions that we were unable to get to. Please continue to follow our work at arabcenterdc.org and save the date for our 7th annual conference coming up next month. It's entitled Security and Securitization in the Middle East and North Africa. And that is going to be taking place virtually October 12th and 13th. Thank you, and we look forward to having you with us.